you are awake right now, reading these words, processing their meaning, perhaps even feeling a slight curiosity about where this conversation will lead us. But here is something extraordinary and disturbing at the same time. You have no idea how you're doing this. At this very moment, trillions of neurons are firing in your brain, creating complex electrical patterns that somehow transform into this singular experience you call being conscious. And the most unsettling truth is that neither you, nor I, nor the brightest scientists on the planet can explain how a cluster of nerve cells can generate this intimate and subjective sensation that is your consciousness. This is perhaps the last great frontier of human knowledge, a mystery so profound that it makes even our most impressive achievements in quantum physics and cosmology seem simple by comparison. Imagine for a moment that you are a neuroscientist from the 22nd century. Looking back at our current era, you would probably laugh with the same condescension with which we laugh at medieval doctors who believed that melancholy was caused by excess black bile. Because the truth is that despite all our technological advances, all our sophisticated brain scans and complex computational models, we are still essentially in the dark about the fundamental nature of consciousness. We know it exists. We know where it probably emerges in the brain. We can even map some of its neural correlations. But the leap between the electrical activity of nerve cells and the subjective experience of being you remains a conceptual abyss that our current science cannot cross. Humanity's journey to understand consciousness is a fascinating story of intellectual hubris and forced humility. For millennia, different cultures created elaborate narratives to explain conscious experience. The ancient Egyptians located consciousness in the heart, believing that the brain was merely an organ for cooling blood. The ancient Greeks, with their typical inclination for philosophical debate, divided between those who, like Aristotle, also favored the heart, and others, like Hippocrates, who began to suspect that the brain might be the true center of conscious experience. Throughout the Middle Ages, consciousness was widely considered a property of the immortal soul, something fundamentally separate from the physical matter of the body. It was only with the Enlightenment that we began to develop a more systematic and scientific approach to understanding the mind. René Descartes, with his famous declaration, "I think, therefore I am," established conscious thought as the only thing we can be absolutely certain of. But Descartes also created a problem that haunts us to this day, mind-body dualism, by proposing that the mind was a non-physical substance that somehow interacted with the physical brain through the pineal gland. He essentially kicked the problem of consciousness under the philosophical carpet, where it remained for centuries. The 19th century brought the first truly scientific insights about the brain. Researchers like Paul Broca and Carl Wernicke began mapping specific functions to specific brain regions, demonstrating that different types of brain damage produced very specific deficits in language and cognition. It was the beginning of modern neuroscience, and with it came a new confidence that we would eventually be able to completely explain consciousness in purely physical terms. The 20th century enormously accelerated our understanding of the brain. We discovered neurotransmitters, mapped neural connections, developed increasingly sophisticated brain imaging techniques. The invention of the electroencephalogram allowed us to listen to the brain's electrical activity in real time. Later, functional magnetic resonance imaging gave us the ability to see which brain regions were most active during different types of mental tasks. Each new discovery seemed to bring us closer to the final solution of the mystery of consciousness. But the more we learned about the brain, the more complex the problem of consciousness became. We discovered that there is no single command center in the brain where consciousness resides. Instead, conscious experience seems to emerge from incredibly complex patterns of activity distributed throughout the neural network. It's as if we were trying to understand a symphony by studying individual instruments without ever being able to capture the music that emerges when they all play together. Today, in the 21st century, we face what many philosophers and scientists call the hard problem of consciousness. This term, coined by philosopher David Chalmers, distinguishes between the easy problems of consciousness, such as explaining how we process information or how we react to stimuli, and the hard problem, which is explaining why there is such a thing as subjective experience at all. Why aren't we just philosophical zombies processing information and reacting appropriately, but without any inner experience? Why is there something like what it's like to be you? This problem becomes even more intriguing when we consider that our conscious experience possesses qualities that seem fundamentally different from anything we know in the physical world. The redness of red, the pain of a headache, the melancholy of a sad song, these qualia, as philosophers call them, don't seem reducible to patterns of neural activity, however complex they may be. How can electrical discharges between nerve cells create the rich, colorful, emotional experience that is human consciousness? Different schools of thought in neuroscience and philosophy of mind have proposed various solutions to this enigma. Eliminative materialists like Paul and Patricia Churchland argue that our intuitive notion of consciousness is simply a cognitive illusion, a pre-scientific concept that will eventually be discarded, just as we discarded concepts like phlogiston or ether. For them, when we finally fully understand how the brain works, we will realize that there is no such thing as consciousness in the sense we imagine. Functionalists, on the other hand, argue that consciousness is defined not by the physical substance of the brain, but by the functional patterns of information processing. In this view, any sufficiently complex system that performs the right kinds of computational operations would be conscious, regardless of whether it's made of biological neurons, silicon chips, or any other material. This perspective opened the way for speculation about conscious artificial intelligence and even the possibility of consciousness uploads. Panpsychists take a radically different approach, proposing that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, like mass or electric charge. In this view, even elementary particles possess some rudimentary form of subjective experience, and complex consciousness emerges when these micro experiences combine in organized systems like brains. While it may sound like science fiction, this idea has gained academic respectability, with philosophers like Galen and Strawson and even some theoretical physicists exploring its implications. More recently, theories like integrated information theory, developed by Giulio Tononi, attempt to quantify consciousness by proposing that it corresponds to the amount of integrated information a system processes. In this view, consciousness is not a binary phenomenon, but a graded property that different systems possess to different degrees. Some versions of this theory lead to the surprising conclusion that even simple systems like photodiodes or thermostats could have minimal levels of consciousness. Meanwhile, neuroscientists like Stanislas Dehaene propose the global workspace consciousness theory, which suggests that consciousness arises when information is widely broadcast across different brain regions, becoming available to multiple cognitive systems simultaneously. This theory attempts to explain why some mental processes are conscious while others remain unconscious, even when they involve complex processing. But perhaps the most disturbing explanation for the mystery of consciousness is the possibility that our brains are simply not capable of fully understanding it. Philosopher Colin McGinn proposed the cognitive mystery hypothesis, arguing that just as a dog will never be able to understand differential calculus, no matter how much it trains, perhaps humans are cognitively limited in a way that prevents us from solving the problem of consciousness. Our brains evolved to help us survive and reproduce, not necessarily to understand the deepest mysteries of reality. This possibility becomes even more unsettling when we consider that we are now creating artificial intelligence systems that can, in some respects, surpass human cognition. If consciousness really requires a specific type of information processing, it's possible that we could inadvertently create conscious machines before we even understand what consciousness is. And if this happens, how would we know? How could we distinguish between a truly conscious machine and one that simply simulates consciousness convincingly? This dilemma is not merely academic. As AI systems become more sophisticated, we begin to face profound ethical questions. If we created an AI system that claimed to be conscious, that reported subjective experiences, that demonstrated behaviors we interpret as evidence of suffering or pleasure, what moral obligations would we have toward it? How could we verify its claims of consciousness, especially given that we don't even fully understand our own consciousness? These questions become even more complex when we consider recent developments in brain-computer interfaces. Companies like Elon Musk's Neuralink are developing technologies that allow direct communication between human brains and computers. If these technologies advance to the point where we can upload human neural patterns to computers or integrate AI directly into our brains, the boundaries between human and artificial consciousness may become completely blurred. I need to pause for a moment to ask you directly. Have you ever had those late-night moments when you suddenly become hyper-aware of your own consciousness? When you stop and think, I am me, I am thinking about thinking, and all the strangeness of conscious experience suddenly becomes almost overwhelming? I know many of us have these moments of existential vertigo but we rarely talk about them, perhaps because we don't have adequate words to describe something so fundamentally intimate and personal. But your experience of this unease about the nature of consciousness is valid and shared. If this feeling resonates with you, share in the comments. I question the nature of my consciousness when your reflection can help others realize they're not alone in this contemplation about the mystery of not being conscious. But the enigma of consciousness is not just a scientific or philosophical curiosity. It has profound implications for how we understand our humanity and our place in the universe. If consciousness is really just a particular type of information processing, this suggests there's nothing fundamentally special about human beings compared to other forms of information processing systems. This perspective can be both liberating and terrifying. On one hand, it suggests that consciousness may not be limited to humans or even biological systems. On the other hand, it may undermine our traditional notions about what makes us unique and valuable as a species. The quest to understand consciousness is also forcing a fundamental re-evaluation of our scientific methodologies. Science traditionally relies on objective observation of phenomena that can be measured and quantified. But consciousness, by its very nature, is subjective. It's fundamentally about how things seem or feel from the interior point of view, and this interior aspect may be, in principle, inaccessible to objective scientific investigation. This limitation has led some researchers to propose new methods for studying consciousness. Neurophenomenology, developed by researchers like Francisco Varela, attempts to combine detailed first-person descriptions of conscious experience with objective measurements of brain activity. The idea is that by training individuals to become extremely precise observers of their own mental states, we can create a kind of contemplative science that bridges the gap between subjectivity and objectivity. Other approaches include using psychedelic substances as research tools to systematically alter states of consciousness and observe corresponding changes in brain activity. Researchers like Robin Carhart-Harris at Imperial College London are using psilocybin and LSD to study how different aspects of conscious experience correspond to different patterns of neural connectivity. While controversial, this research is providing unique insights into the neurobiology of consciousness and may eventually lead to new treatments for conditions like depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. But perhaps the most profound implication of the mystery of consciousness is what it tells us about the limits of human knowledge. For the past 400 years, science has been extraordinarily successful in explaining phenomenon after phenomenon that once seemed completely mysterious. We discovered that heat is molecular motion, that light is electromagnetic radiation, that heredity is encoded in DNA. This sequence of successes led us to growing confidence that eventually science would be able to explain everything. Consciousness represents a fundamental challenge to this confidence. It's not just another complex phenomenon awaiting explanation. It's a phenomenon that questions the very foundations of how we do science. If consciousness really involves aspects of reality that are fundamentally inaccessible to objective scientific investigation, then perhaps there are inherent limits to what science can teach us about the nature of reality. This possibility shouldn't be dismissed lightly. After all, we've already discovered other fundamental limits to knowledge. Gödel's incompleteness theorem showed that there are mathematical truths that can never be proved within formal systems. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle demonstrated that there are aspects of physical reality that cannot be known simultaneously with perfect precision. Perhaps consciousness represents a similar fundamental limit, not just to what we can know, but to what is possible to know using the methods of objective science. If this is the case, it doesn't mean we should stop trying to understand consciousness. Instead, it may mean we need to expand our notions about what constitutes valid knowledge and develop new ways of investigating aspects of reality that don't conform to traditional scientific methods. It may mean that philosophical contemplation, careful introspection, meditative practices, and even artistic and poetic exploration may have legitimate roles in our quest to understand the nature of conscious experience. This perspective also has important implications for how we think about artificial intelligence and the future of cognition. If consciousness really involves aspects of reality that go beyond computational processing, then creating truly conscious AI may be more challenging than many technologists assume. It may require not just advances in computational power and algorithms, but a fundamentally new understanding of the nature of reality itself. On the other hand, if consciousness is really just a particular type of information processing, then it may be possible to recreate and even improve conscious experience in non-biological substrates. This possibility raises fascinating questions about the future of humanity. Could we eventually transcend the limitations of our biological brains? Could we expand our consciousness in ways that are currently unimaginable? Or would we lose something essentially human in the process? These questions become even more urgent when we consider that technology is already beginning to alter the nature of human conscious experience. Smartphones and social media are changing how we pay attention and process information. Virtual and augmented reality are beginning to blur the boundaries between real and artificial experience. Smart drugs and transcranial stimulation are offering new ways to modify states of consciousness. We live in an era when the very nature of human conscious experience is being transformed by our technologies. But perhaps the most profound aspect of the enigma of consciousness is what it reveals about the fundamentally mysterious nature of existence itself. Consciousness reminds us that despite all our scientific and technological advances, we still live in a universe full of deep mysteries. It's a reminder of humility, an indication that there will always be aspects of reality that challenge our complete understanding. This humility may be especially important in an era when humanity is acquiring almost divine powers through technology. We are developing the ability to edit genes, create artificial intelligence, and possibly even create artificial consciousness. Under these circumstances, the persistent mystery of consciousness serves as an important reminder that there are aspects of reality we still don't fully understand, and that we should proceed with caution and humility. The question of consciousness also forces us to confront fundamental questions about values and meaning. If we are just, biological machines processing information? Does this undermine the meaning and value we attribute to human experience? Or does the fact that physical processes can give rise to the rich tapestry of conscious experience make existence even more extraordinary and precious? Different people respond to these questions in different ways, and perhaps this is appropriate. The mystery of consciousness may be one of those aspects of human existence that is better lived and experienced than completely understood. Perhaps the very quest to understand consciousness is more important than finding a definitive answer, because it forces us to contemplate profound questions about our nature and our place in the universe. As we advance toward a future increasingly dominated by artificial intelligence and biotechnology, these questions about consciousness will become even more important. We will need to make decisions about what kinds of artificial systems to create, how to regulate technologies that may affect human consciousness, and how to maintain our humanity in a world increasingly dominated by intelligent machines. These decisions will be informed not just by practical and economic considerations, but by our deepest understandings about the nature of consciousness and what it means to be human. The enigma of consciousness also teaches us something important about the nature of scientific and philosophical inquiry itself. It reminds us that the most important questions are not always those for which we can find clear and definitive answers. Sometimes, the questions that transform us most deeply are those that continue to challenge us, that resist our attempts at simple categorization and explanation. In this sense, consciousness may be similar to other fundamental questions that have fascinated humanity throughout history: the nature of beauty, the meaning of existence, the possibility of life after death. These are questions that each generation must answer for itself, not because previous generations failed to find the right answers, but because the very act of wrestling with these questions is an essential part of what it means to be human. When we contemplate the mystery of consciousness, we are forced to confront the fundamental strangeness of our own existence. How is it possible that a universe apparently composed of mindless particles spinning through empty space could give rise to beings who experience pain and pleasure, who contemplate their own mortality, who create art and music, who fall in love and suffer losses? This is perhaps the deepest question we can ask, and the fact that we don't have a complete answer to it doesn't diminish its importance. In fact, it may be precisely because consciousness remains mysterious that it continues to inspire so much fascination and investigation. If we fully understood how consciousness arises from the brain, if we could reduce it to equations and algorithms, would it lose something of its capacity to amaze and transform us? Perhaps there is wisdom in accepting that some aspects of existence will always remain beyond our complete understanding, and that this is a feature, not a bug, of the human condition. This recognition of the mysterious nature of consciousness may also lead us to greater appreciation for the preciousness and fragility of conscious experience. If consciousness is truly a rare and extraordinary phenomenon in the universe, this suggests we should treat it with the respect and care it deserves. This may have important implications for how we think about ethical issues related to suffering, animal rights, care for people in altered states of consciousness, and the creation of artificial systems that may be conscious. Finally, the enigma of consciousness reminds us of the importance of intellectual humility. In an age when we are often tempted to believe that science and technology can solve all problems and answer all questions, consciousness remains as a persistent reminder that there is still much we don't know about the nature of reality. This humility may be especially important as we develop increasingly powerful technologies that can affect the human mind and consciousness. Thus, while we may never completely solve the enigma of consciousness, the journey to understand it continues to be one of the most important and transformative that humanity can undertake. It's a journey that takes us to the deepest questions about our nature, our purpose, and our place in the cosmos. And perhaps in the end, these are exactly the questions we most need to keep asking, even if, or especially because, they don't have easy answers. If these reflections have touched on something you've been feeling, but perhaps haven't found words to express, know that you're not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you'll connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the fundamental mysteries of our existence. Each week, we meet here to explore together the great questions that define our experience as conscious beings and to seek not just understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the mysteries that surround us. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us on this continuous journey. Subscribe so we can continue this essential conversation about what it means to be conscious in a universe we can barely comprehend.
The problem of truth is that the truth, first of all, is costly, whereas fiction is very cheap. If you want to write a truthful history book about the Roman Empire, for instance, you need to invest a lot of energy, time, money. You need to study Latin. You probably need to study Greek, ancient Greek. You need to do archaeological excavations and find these ancient, whether inscriptions or pottery or weapons, and analyze them. Very costly and difficult. To write a fictional story about the Roman Empire, very easy. You just write anything you want and it's there on the page or on the internet. The truth is often also very complicated because reality is complicated. You want to give a truthful explanation for why the Roman Republic fell or why the Roman Empire eventually fell. Very complicated. Whereas fiction can be made as simple as possible, and people tend to prefer simple explanations over complicated ones. And finally, the truth can be painful, unattractive. We often don't want to know the truth about ourselves, whether as individuals, which is why we go to therapy for many years to know the things we don't want to know about ourselves, and also on the level of entire nations. You know, each nation has its own dark episodes, its own skeletons or cemeteries in the closet that people don't want to know about. A politician that, in an election campaign would just tell people the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, is unlikely to win many votes. So in this competition between the truth, which is costly and complicated and sometimes painful, and fiction, which is cheap and simple and you can make it very attractive, fiction tends to win. And if you look at, the large-scale systems, networks in history, they are often built on fictions, not on the truth.
One of the reasons that the order of the world is collapsing is that we have deficit of trust. And it makes us extremely vulnerable to AI. And it also guarantees a very dangerous kind of AI that will try and probably succeed in taking the world from us. You can think about AIs as the children of humanity. When you try to educate children, there are the things you say to them, and there are the things they observe you actually do. And your behavior has far more influence on their education than what you tell them to do. So if we kind of tell our AIs, don't be power hungry, don't be untrustworthy, don't cheat, don't lie, don't manipulate. And then the AI observes us constantly manipulating and cheating and grabbing power. The AI will learn from how we behave. If the AI tycoon himself, or in rare cases herself, behaves in an untrustworthy way, he himself believes that all the world is just a power struggle, there is no way that he can produce a trustworthy AI. The good news is that this entire worldview is not just cynical and dangerous, it's also a mistake. It's not true that the only reality is power and that all human interactions are power struggles. Yes, power is an important part of the world. Yes, some human interactions or some part of human interactions, they are power struggles. And yes, some institutions or all institutions, they have problem with corruption, they have problem with people manipulating, but this is not the whole of reality. There are other aspects to human beings. Human beings, I think, are all of them, except if there are some extreme psychopaths, they are genuinely interested in love, in compassion, in truth. This is not some cynical maneuver to gain power. What I would tell people who believe in the cynical, power-hungry worldview is just observe yourself. Is this the way you think about yourself? Do you think that you yourself don't care at all about the truth and you just want power? Probably not. You probably think you're different. If you have a better view of yourself, why aren't you charitable enough to acknowledge that other people, just like you, might also be really interested in knowing the truth or in having loving relationships with other beings? This is where we can start to build a more trustworthy philosophy, which is the only stable foundation for a good society and also for benevolent AIs.
How do you think AI will change storytelling from what it used to be?
Stories are some of the most powerful technologies in history. Whether it's the story of Jesus or whether it's the story of money, this is really the foundation of human civilization, is stories. Everything else is built on top of it. And for tens of thousands of years, the only entities on this planet that could create stories, either create new stories or elaborate and interpret old stories, were human beings. Only the human mind was capable of doing it. And now we have on this planet another entity which is capable of spreading and interpreting and ultimately creating stories. And it's only the beginning, it's nothing, it's just 10 years since the AI revolution began. We haven't seen anything yet.